Good morning. Welcome to this panel on advancing bioeconomy for sustainable growth. This panel has a special importance for us, actually. As you know, the G20 agenda has been more operational than transformational up to now. But this year, we are trying to create a transformational agenda. We are trying to create transformational topics to shape the future G20 agenda. And one of them is biotechnology. This is so important for us. I think this panel will be the starting point to shape the future G20 agenda, to shape the transformational issues. Thank you so much for your interest. And Justin Patterson will moderate this panel. He is a senior advisor at Nova Enzymes. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours, Justin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Firstly, a big thanks to our G20 and B20 hosts, friends and colleagues, to Tob and to Tepaf for arranging everything. It's been a great year so far. We've got a few months left. It's certainly been very, very enjoyable getting to know and work with all of you. So thank you for that. So again, thank you for coming to this session. One small piece of housekeeping before we do get started. The Prime Minister is speaking directly after coffee. So we'll get you out of here at 10 o'clock, because I'm sure he will have a lot of great things to say and is a very entertaining and engaging speaker. So without further ado, we shall move on to the panel itself. And I'd firstly just like to briefly introduce the panelists that we have today with us. Certainly a very esteemed collection of experts from across industries, from across the full remit of what the bioeconomy is and can actually do. So we are very, very fortunate and delighted to have with us today Joachim Brown, who is the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute, also known as IFPRI. We have Natalie Molf, who's the Secretary General of Europa Bio, based in Brussels. And we have some good friends and colleagues from Turkey as well, Fabrizio Gudi, who's the General Manager of Sanofi, and Askar Rangulawa, who is the General Manager from Johnson & Johnson. So I'm going to hand over to our esteemed panel very, very shortly, but just a couple of comments, perhaps really to frame what we're going to try and do this morning together. Firstly, we'd like to try and look at what the bioeconomy is really all about. What does it mean to us? Not only today, but also looking forward into the future. What are the opportunities? What are the challenges that we all face? And how do we go about addressing those through policy recommendations, through work such as the B20? We'll also try and actually come to some conclusions by the end of today, so that we actually have something concrete that we can move forward with. And I have to pay particular thanks not only to Tob and to Tepaf, but also to the T20, which is the think tank group that works alongside the B20, for really trying to bring these new issues onto the agenda, and also to the Turkish G20 presidency for trying to push innovation, inclusiveness, and some of the other issues that perhaps weren't traditionally part of the original G20 focus, but are certainly very important for the economy and for forward-looking growth. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Joachim Brown, and maybe I could just pose one question to get us started. You sit at the interface between science, policy, and business. So for you, what is the bioeconomy? What does it mean? And how can we learn, share, and work forward together?
Is it on? Yeah. Thank you, Justin. Good morning, everyone. Really pleased that G20 puts this on the agenda. Well, we are all committed to bioeconomy and biotech, but there's a surprising trend. In the last 5 years, more than 30 countries have written themselves bioeconomy strategies and policies. Virtually all G20 or B20 countries are among them. How come that this has taken off as a trend into the bioeconomy, which I will define in a moment, Justin, because lots of people see something different in it. There are three fundamental reasons which drive a business, consumers and governments into the bioeconomy. Number one is the progress in science. Number two is the preferences of consumers have changed. The global middle class wants sustainability. There's a change in attitudes. And third, the anticipation of raw material prices going up, and we need to come to a different type of growth. I understand that this G20 meeting very much focuses on growth, but we, in this session, I think, should very much focus on the quality of that growth. We define bioeconomy as the production and utilization of biological resources, so production and utilization of resources, but also the utilization of biological intelligence, the smartness of nature, to provide products, processes, and services in virtually all sectors. Agriculture and food are core components. Wood, forestry products, pulp and paper are classical components. But the range of products which we produce within a bioeconomy framework go much further, also in the biopharmaceutical products, in the new fiber products, copying what spiders do with new proteins, new construction materials. The car industry has picked up on bioplastics. The wood manufacturing, producing wood pipes with totally new materials which have better properties than steel and concrete in construction. Those are pioneering new construction and processing elements in the bioeconomy. Fundamental in bioeconomy is that it reduces waste, which is one of the key objectives in the G20 agenda, prevents waste and uses remaining materials. So the principle is circular economy and cascade use. Don't grow corn and burn it, but do something useful first before the rest is used for energy is a principle. Lastly, let me point out that there are, of course, conflicts in this topic. The world food equation is changing through the bioeconomy because the demand for plant-based raw materials is increasing. That may have an impact, an adverse impact on food prices and on food security. So we have to factor in the food security agenda, and a smart bioeconomy will invest more in science and technology to prevent rising food prices, will include small farmers, which are among the poorest of the poor, the 500 million small farmers, and will be smart on pricing carbon and pricing energy. My plea to the G20 is that, number one, the regulatory frameworks need to improve. We cannot just have 20 different bioeconomy strategies which are not in sync, which are not synchronized, so we need dialogue on the regulatory frameworks. Number two, we need exchange on the knowledge base for the bioeconomy. So that requires that the science policies need to be more open and we share the knowledge across the G20 countries and beyond. Those two priorities we will also discuss further at the first Global Bioeconomy Summit, to which we have invited in Berlin under the patronage of Chancellor Angela Merkel, November 25 and 6 of this year. And it would be great if many of you could come. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Joachim. You've touched on a number of areas already. I think maybe we can come back to some of those a little bit later when we open the floor for what I hope will be a very engaging Q&A. I'd like now to move to Natalie Moll, who is the Secretary General of Europa Bio. Natalie, Joachim has already touched on a number of industries, a number of opportunities. He's also highlighted, for example, agriculture and energy as areas where the bioeconomy can engage. And he's also stressed that there are a number of countries already active in this space. You sit in Brussels in the middle of 27, 29 countries that are all very heavily engaged in this discussion. I know you're at the heart of that. What are your views on how some of those areas can be taken forward and are moving forward?
Thank you very much, Justin, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me this morning. Yes, Europa Bio, just for people who don't know, so we're the business association for all the biotech industries active in Europe. So healthcare companies, industrial biotech companies enabling the bioeconomy, and agricultural biotech companies. So you have about 60 members plus national associations in those countries representing about 2,000 SMEs. So our job is basically to make the environment for biotech the best possible environment in Europe so that companies come, grow, and stay in Europe. Having said that, I really think that, and this morning what I'd like to talk is a little bit about the benefits, so what you mentioned there, and maybe some ideas on how we can enable the bioeconomy and biotech globally, because we all know about the challenges that our resources will face with a 9 billion population in 2050. And the good news as business players, and maybe for governments in the G20, is that we can actually turn a challenge into an opportunity. We have the technology and the compassion to actually face those challenges through the bioeconomy, I believe, in all three sectors. The OECD has predicted that biotech will represent 2.7% of member states' GDP by 2030. That's a lot, 2.7%, that's a lot. And why is that? Because there are a number of benefits. So I'll talk about the benefits, and then I'll talk about some of the obstacles that maybe need to be removed. For example, in industrial biotechnology, so that's the biological processes by which you transform something into something else that's useful, if you like. And one of the backbones of the bioeconomy, maybe the easiest to recognize. Areas that Joachim just mentioned, pulp and paper, you can reduce chlorine chemicals by about 10 to 15%. You can reduce energy for bleaching 40%. If you have bio-based products, including cosmetics, instead of petroleum-based, you can reduce 65% of CO2 emissions and petroleum use, which is something that we're looking for. We're looking for that change in resource dependency. Biofuels reduction of GHG emissions by up to 90%. The WWF, interestingly, did a study on industrial biotech and estimated that the industrial biotech could help save up to 2.5 billion tons of CO2 into the emission, which is equivalent to all the cars in China by 2020. So you can see how this is a business opportunity that fits in with the challenge of sustainability and making it right. But talking about business, jobs, and growth, what does it really mean in terms of business for us? And a couple of interesting studies maybe for you. A McKinsey study for the World Economic Forum recently calculated that in 2020, the global industrial biotech market will be of 200 billion euros. That's not far down the line, and that's a big number. In terms of jobs, Bloomberg estimated about the creation of 1 million jobs between 2010 and 2030. And again, interesting, it's many rural jobs, because these are agricultural chains. This is about growing, collecting, and storing, and transforming residues and plant products. And the Commission, as you were saying, has identified this really as a priority in terms of reducing the dependency on imports and having local production of high-value goods. So you can see how the environmental benefits fit together with the economic benefits. There are also consumer benefits, because nowadays, as Joachim mentioned, consumers, we're also connected, that really what consumers think and want gets to the business much faster than it used to. It's not just when it's on the shelves, but it's much earlier already. So if you look at their interest in sustainability, you can see that bio-based solvents, for example, have less volatile organic components. You can have biodegradable products such as lubricants. You can have recyclable, renewable, and the famous CO2 capture loop reduction. So those are all benefits that speak to all different portions, hopefully, the political objectives, the business objectives, and the consumer objectives. You'll hear, I know, about healthcare benefits of biotech, so I don't need to go too long through those, but I mean, know that right now, 50% of all medicines are biotech at the moment in the pipeline. And there's about 650 medicines being tested for over 100 diseases. So really, biotech is just climbing up, and it's the successful way to go. Even in agriculture, and I know this is a touchy subject, at the moment, last year at least, there were 18 million farmers around the world cultivating 181 million hectares of GMO crops, so biotech crops. The objective here in 28 countries, 8 of which are developed, the objective here is to develop crops that work when and where they are needed. It's not to develop crops that take over the world, and I think that needs to be explained very, very clearly. There are new second-generation benefits, consumer benefits. It's about drought. It's about oil structures. So I think, again, the capacity of industry to adapt to the needs of consumers and generally resource needs. In both these areas, industrial biotech and agricultural biotech, the use of public-private partnerships, so something that Joachim mentioned as well, the way that the governments and the industry and research community work together has made it possible to make the real advances. I don't think nowadays we can think that industry can go it alone. I think it would be a shame, and a number of public-private partnerships have shown that we don't need to. In Europe recently, we approved a public-private partnership for 4 billion euros for 7 years on the bioeconomy. It's mainly on industrial biotech, but you have the farmers there, you have the biotech industry, the food companies, and all the other producers, the grains, etc. And you really have us all working together to make it happen so much faster than if we tried on our own, and with some money, which we don't have on our own. So maybe something to keep in mind for governments. So last point, just really, what are the enabling factors? Joachim mentioned already regulation. I would say human capital. You need the skilled and trained humans to do the work, the infrastructure for R&D, the investment in R&D. You need intellectual property. You can't not have anything without that. Tech transfer, we mentioned, from public to private. You need some market incentives, because very often these were products that replace products that are already there. So I can give you a plastic bottle, but you already have a plastic bottle. And the bio-based one costs a little bit more. So what is my market incentive to get there? Some tax, some R&D credits. What is it that will help me get into the market? And legal certainty, so transparency, predictability. It's easy to say, you're all business people, you know that that's very important, but in some areas like GMOs and in some parts of the world, legal certainty is impossible. So that's really it. I think an opportunity. There have been studies that have been run. I mean, we ran one last year with Ernst & Young to see around the world what are the incentives and obstacles to setting up a biotech company. So we have Europe mapped here, but we also have Singapore, the US, China, India, Australia, Brazil. And the idea there is can the G20 government sit down and say, okay, well, let me have a look. What is best practice? Okay, what works in Brazil? What could work here? What could work? And learning from each other, rather than each trying to develop their own national bioeconomy strategy, as Joachim said, and then not making the most of it. So maybe this is not the Bible, but I think that the G20, if they could identify biotech as one of the amazing opportunities for business and sustainability, then do some background work, share best practices, and move forward.
Natalie, thank you. You've raised a number of topics that are actually really heart of the G20 and the B20 agendas: human capital, investment, IP. They're all there, and I think they're all being discussed in quite some detail with some very solid recommendations. So again, I think we should look to take the work of this discussion forward into that area. You've also touched on a very important topic, of course, people. We've heard about consumers today. We've heard about already farmers part of the solution, or the opportunity, if you like, when it comes to bioeconomy. And Asghar and I were actually talking yesterday about, obviously, aging populations and what that actually means, particularly if you're a healthcare company. So we've heard some fantastic numbers already in terms of the opportunities that biotechnology and bioeconomy holds for GDP growth. But of course, aging populations require more medicines. So, Asghar, maybe with that thought, could you just highlight maybe what Johnson & Johnson and you are actually doing to look at some of those issues in terms of R&D, your pipeline and innovation?
Right, many thanks. Most of you probably are familiar with J&J. We are the biggest healthcare company in the world, 75 billion sales, so broadly based in all the different sectors, the medical device, consumer, and also pharmaceuticals. And you know, we have a very clear decision taken a couple of years ago that we, as J&J, focus only on innovation. Only innovation. We are not producing any Me Too products, whatever, really breakthrough innovation. This is the focus. But we are also observing, I think this is also something we see across the globe, and coming back to what you mentioned about the funding. Yeah? So that means what we observe is that healthcare investments is not seen as an investment, it's more seen as a cost. And we are confronted with a lot of austerity measures across the globe, which is difficult to let's say, to also digest, simply because we have to invest a lot of money in R&D. So that means I hear you talking about biotechnology as an innovative area, and I hear you also that this is a driver for an economy. On the other hand, what we in reality observe, and not only in Turkey, I think across the globe, obviously you will also have the same experience most probably with Sanofi, that, you know, especially in pharmaceuticals, we are seen as a cost factor. So let's discuss that for a while, because I think that's also a relevant topic for all the countries represented in the G20. Simply because, you know, we all are faced with a more aging population, we see much more chronic disease, and we have actually the global healthcare market, if you want, has a size of $6.5 trillion, which is quite sizable, and it will grow further. Why is it growing further? Because we're all getting older, we're all getting a little bit more heavy, and so we see many, many chronic diseases. Out of the 6.5 trillion, 70% is coming from chronic diseases, which is a remarkable number. The question is, how much indirect cost on top of the 6.5 trillion do we have due by care, due by loss of productivity, and so forth and so forth? It's really, I think we are not able to quantify that really, but it's really a substantial amount. So if we talk about growth, if we talk about, let's say, productivity in the society, healthcare is a crucial element to ensure that. I think that's pretty obvious. The question is, why? This is really a question I don't have an answer. I would be very happy to have an open dialogue about that. Why is it seen in pharmaceuticals as a cost factor, not as an investment in a more productive, in a more healthy, in a more stable population, which is also bringing growth back to the society, to the economy? I think that logic chain needs to be discussed. There are a couple of prerequisites about that. First of all, you know, we as industry, we need to have an environment where R&D is also rewarded, and value we bring with products is rewarded as well. We need to have security if it comes to regulation, but most probably we're going to talk about that later as well. So there are a couple of elements we really need to focus as an let's say, group of countries, simply because in the future, without the innovation in healthcare, we are going to run in an enormous problem to keep the growth in all the different industry running, because the population is not healthy enough, is not stable enough to do that in the future.
Thank you, Asghar. Moving within the healthcare space, we're very fortunate to have Fabrizio with us. Sanofi has actually looked at its strategy in terms of the bioeconomy and also in terms of investments and R&D. And I know that you've been quite heavily engaged and involved in that discussion, particularly in terms of how you can foster innovation and move things forward. Obviously, as we've also heard, public policy is a really important component of that. So maybe just sort of, if we could just ask you for some thoughts on how you foster innovation and combine both public policy and business models.
So thank you very much for inviting me at this B20. It's a real pleasure. The question is, why biotechnologies? I think that everyone realizes that the future will not be anymore only to have more life expectancy, but is more quality of life. And biotechnology will address this point. Now, the market is growing very fast, from 100 billion worldwide in 2007 to 250 billion in 2020. So everybody wants to be there. Now, how to manage that big pharma enter this market, and it's really adapted for biotechnology. I can give you the example of Sanofi. Sanofi decided to make this transfer, and the first thing that we did is to look inside what do we have already in biotechnology. We have vaccine, and that we have already some knowledge, we have diabetes, but it's not enough. And alone, we don't have the flexibility, and probably we are not able to think out of the box in order to be really on top on biotechnology. Therefore, we have to work with new companies, with small biotechnology companies, which need also big pharma because they don't have the infrastructure otherwise to develop. So this collaboration starts everywhere. So for instance, Sanofi work with Regeneron, and we will bring on the market some monoclonal antibody, which will bring some solution for diseases that for the time being they are still not over. And then the second point, which is very important, is also to have some external collaboration with venture capital to invest also for new technologies, which is something that we are doing very fast. Then the question is where we want to invest. Where is the ecosystem, the localization, the best one in order to grow? And this is really related with the government and with the public institution that will help the companies to grow. They have the human capitals and so on. This is very important also to have a look at that. I think that it's important in the B20 and G20 to address really the high quality in terms of regulation and to have high standards in all countries in order really to make biotechnologies developing with a really high quality.
Mauricio, thank you. I'm going to open the floor for questions if there are any at this stage. Please feel free to raise your hand. I don't know if we've got microphones, otherwise we'll manage. Sorry, it's just coming.
Thank you. I'm Yusuf Işık, economist. Natalie Moll has said that the G20 could deal with biotechnology. It would be productive. My question is, what could the G20 do? Because it's a sort of high level, is known as an economic structure. So, and secondly, of course, the enormous cost to research, enormous benefits, and the state always helps in one, well, often helps in one way or another at the initial stage through research or PPP. But there are, as you know, very critical discussions on, about the benefits. Of course, the companies have to benefit, but some well-known drugs have been very expensive. So could there be some sort of agreement on distributing the benefit to the population without discouraging the companies? Thank you.
Great, thank you for the question. So I think that's really three parts. What can the G20 do? How can we work with public-private partnerships in particular? And then how do we look about getting the benefits of the bioeconomy and biotechnology solutions out to the wider economy and obviously to societies? Could I start with Joachim maybe on that question? Because I know that you've obviously, in addition to IFPRI, done a lot of work with the German government as well on some of these topics.
Great question. You touch on the governance issues of bioeconomy. So what's the current picture? Virtually every G20 country has some sort of science advisory body on bioeconomy and biotech and so on, and but of different structures, and they don't talk to each other. So make them talk to each other. Can the G20 stimulate a council of councils on bioeconomy, which would be composed of the scientific advisors, industry, civil society? I suggest governments should not sit in there. They should be at the receiving end. They should receive the advice on which strategic directions bioeconomy should take. Second observation, biomass resources are very unequally distributed in the world. And the big resource base of biomass, which matters for bioeconomy, is in the south, not in the north, except in Scandinavia and a bit of Russia and Canada. But those are the exceptions and smaller economies. So I think we need to come to a bioeconomy strategy which fosters useful trade. There was so much good discussions yesterday on trade, but an environmentally sustainable trade regime is necessary for the bioeconomy. Third, I think what the G20 could do is to be very focused on exchanging science and coming up with framework for regulatory regimes. Not over-regulation, but fundamentally bioeconomy is about solving the big issues which the world economy is confronted with. Climate change, increased water scarcity, tremendous food insecurity affecting many people, and unhealthy lifestyles in the process of urbanization. So that's we must portray the bioeconomy story as a solution to these issues, and again, the G20 should have such fora to follow up next time in China and the time after in Germany.
Thank you, Joachim. So very much the beginning of a conversation, certainly not the end. I don't know if anyone else would like to come in on that question. Asghar?
Perhaps, and that's a very good point, what you raised is about the funding for research and what is the frame for that. I can talk mainly about healthcare. You know, actually the cost for a clinical trial to produce a new product in pharmaceuticals around between $1.2 billion to $1.5 billion, which is really a substantial number. If we take all the failures that we are confronted with in the trials, we come up to $4 to $5 billion per product, which is really an enormous investment. The question is, this is really risky money. Huh? This is really a kind of even venture capital, if you want. And the company must be very sizable in order to finance that, and therefore you see a concentration in the pharmaceutical sector. Look, to share the risk with the governments, or with some selected governments, with a group of governments, would be, I think, a very smart way forward. Yeah? And also that would also most probably lead to lower prices at the end, you know, because actually we have to get the return of our investment in this short period. We have the patent protection, which is only because of some regulational challenges in different countries, it ending up to 7 to 8 years, not 10 years even anymore, that we don't have patent protection. And generics are coming very, very fast, and then the market is gone. So that means we need to earn our money in this short period. So that means to enter into private-public partnerships, to make research together, is really perhaps the way out, to have at the end lower prices, but on the other hand also to reduce the risk for us as an industry.
Great, thank you. Could I just ask Fabrizio to come in, and then Natalie on PPPs. I learned a fantastic quote a couple of weeks ago from Soichiro Honda, who said that success is 99% failure. And obviously working in the pharma sector and obviously looking at innovation, Fabrizio, maybe you have some thoughts in terms of what's just been said by Asghar.
No, I wanted to add at first that what is important for sure is to have some discussion with the government to find how we can share the investment, or at least be supported then for the investments. But I think also that this is in the framework probably for a G20. We should be also integrated much earlier in the discussion in order to see what is the future, what we can do, what we can deliver. This partnership, see us more as partner, not a enemy or a cost producer. I think that it will help to manage really the cost, and we will also be able to find a specific solution which are more adapted and better.
Right. Thank you, Fabrizio. Natalie, speaking of integrated partnerships, I know that you have been one of the driving forces behind the European Union's bio-based industry work. So again, with the comments on public-private partnerships, it would be great to hear your views.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, I mean, just picking up also on the question around how do you make the cost discussion work? I think there's a calculation that needs to be made that goes beyond the cost of the medicine for the patient and encompasses what that patient coming back to work means, what not having the carers, what not having him in hospital. So that conversation, and I think slowly that's happening, but the conversation today has always been the cost of the drug, how many patients, overall, okay, let's cut it. And I think that, you know, we need to have a little bit of a wider discussion around that. And in terms of PPPs, and I mean, PPPs is one of the many ways that we have to work together to make biotech work. And as Joachim said, the G20 can start from something. I mean, there are some figures on how biotech is doing in what countries are doing to help biotech in Europe, around the world. Sit down. And it's not just the science. I think it needs to be the industry ministers, it needs to be the economic ministers, it needs to be this, you know, the environment or agriculture, whatever you want to call them, health ministers, so that they all have a clear idea, okay, we want to invest in this area, these are the opportunities, these are the costs, this is what my neighbor is doing, this is what the person on the other side of the world is doing. How can we learn from best practice and get it going? But first it needs to be identified as a priority. And perhaps having it today here is already the first step. This is the, you know, and then China, and then etc. But it really needs to be done, and then partner, and that's something that only heads of state can decide. Yes, we will work on this as more than one ministry, you know, as a group of countries and as a group of ministries who want to invest in that.
Great, thank you, Natalie. More questions? Yes.
My name is Onur Uranlı. I'm actually a director at the Sealed Air Corporation, world's leading sustainability company. One of the hot topics on the agendas of biopharmaceutical meetings is actually cold chain. And I was curious to find out, has B20 done anything about cold chain, or has there been any discussions about it, or will there be any discussions? And if not, then if any of the individual companies done anything about in terms of cold chain, and what types of work can be done or will be done?
I'm not aware of anything that's been done actually within the B20 structure yet, but maybe I could just open that to the panelists.
You know, let's talk about generally about this is an observation we had that, you know, healthcare and innovation in healthcare and supply is definitely an important element of that. It's not even a topic on the G20 agenda. So that means this was for me a big surprise already. Therefore, I'm happy to have this kind of forum, because I fully agree that's a very substantial element of let's say, of the growth. And if you talk about growth in the B20 and also about regulations in the G20, it definitely should be addressed. So to your question, no, it wasn't discussed. For sure, we as a company, I think Sanofi is saying, we have a lot of thoughts about supply chain with the new compounds, which has a different stability than the old drugs like aspirin and these kind of products. Definitely a big topic for us, but we try to handle that internally. But, you know, supply chain in pharmaceuticals becoming more and more a problem. This has to do with some borders, with taxes. You know, very, very difficult. We cannot build up supply centers across the globe in every city, every country. That's a big challenge for us, indeed. And it's also, let's say, a limiting factor to distribute our products to patients in need. We should not forget that, because sometimes simply not possible to deliver products to different countries. That's a big challenge.
More questions from the floor? No. But actually, I'd like to come back on something that Joachim mentioned earlier on, this idea of sustainability and how you actually assure sustainability, particularly across value and supply chains. And we were talking yesterday, and you said that we shouldn't think in terms of value or supply chains, but really webs, and how these areas all interconnect. I just wondered maybe if you had some further thoughts on that topic.
Well, thank you for prompting us. Everyone is familiar with the concept of value chains, and to make them more efficient, cut transactions costs in them, and so on. But when we talk bioeconomy, we are not talking value chains. We are talking interlinked value chains. We call that value webs. That's difficult economics, to optimize a value web, where things are used, reused. Bioeconomy is not a sector. It's cutting across virtually all important sectors. Bioeconomy is a strategy which cuts an innovation and industrialization strategy, which cuts, for instance, across agriculture, industry, and services. So the old concepts don't apply. Sustainability, which you asked about, is the fundamental objective of a bioeconomy strategy, the zero footprint economy. We cannot come to harmony between nature and humankind in a 10 billion world with the current industrial structures, with the current infrastructure structures. That's why I think a key message to the G20 should be that, number one, yes, industry can make good money in bioeconomy, but the returns to investment for society are much larger than the private returns. They come in terms of sustainability returns. And that's why it's a political strategy issue, and not just an industry strategy issue. Bringing down the footprint in water use, in land degradation, and carbon emissions, in biodiversity, diminishing economies, is the fundamental goal of bioeconomy, and that the heads of state will sign in 2 weeks the new Sustainable Development Agenda is essentially a step which will further push the bioeconomy upwards.
Thank you, Joachim. There's also a lot of talk around sustainability in terms of what's called triple bottom line reporting, so economic, environmental, and social aspects. I think actually Joachim's turned that equation on its head for us, and really what we're talking about is triple bottom line returns in terms of benefits to societies, to economies, and also obviously to the planet. One of the other big themes, of course, of the G20 is growth and jobs, looking particularly not only at urban areas but also rural economies. Natalie, if I may, I know you've done a lot of work in that space as well in terms of how some of the ideas, the innovation within the bioeconomy can actually be deployed and implemented and turned into real, value-adding jobs. And so obviously for the benefits of society. So maybe a few thoughts on that.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, I think it's one of the first developments where you're actually giving jobs in rural areas rather than taking them away. I mean, until now, everything has been about moving people out of rural areas. All our industries have been about moving people out. All of economic development services. And suddenly you have a development that not only produces CO2 emission reductions to the order of 2.5 billion a ton by 2020, like the WWF estimated, but you're also needing jobs in rural areas, in coastal areas, all of the bioeconomy related to the sea and marine resources, but also the bioeconomy in general. You need farmers to grow things, you need residues to be picked up, you need storage, you need transformation, and that is done not in cities, that is done in the fields. And actually the shorter the chains, the more valuable the whole process is. So sustainable trade, as Joachim mentioned, in the worst case, in the best case, production locally and improve production. So suddenly you're seeing those 1 million jobs in 20 years that Bloomberg has predicted being mostly in rural areas. And this is something that I'm sure not only in Europe but in other parts of the world is essential, because we can believe that we can live off anything but the land, but actually we can't, and we need to differentiate. Our population is growing to an incredible extent, and having people scattered around is probably better than trying to fit them all in the same place. Also, when we're developing the southern part of the world, countries that depend a lot on agriculture, giving them jobs that are more than just producing food, because producing food is stable, but you have to have a good crop. It has to look nice. It has to be competitive. For bio-based economy, you're often dealing with residues. The quality of the residues is important, but it's not the same quality level that you're looking for food. So you're giving that farmer new ways of developing and becoming a player in economic terms. And that's also important. So you're empowering a whole new level of society that before was not considered maybe business, apart from in some parts of the world like the US, where farmers are very much considered businessmen.
Right. Thank you, Natalie. A question from the floor.
Hasan Zeytin. I have a related questions to Natalie. Yesterday and today we've been talking about the SMEs, the importance of SMEs for the future, and you are talking about creating jobs in rural area. And you at the beginning of the talk that you mentioned you are represented about 2,000 SMEs in Europe. When I looked at about 5-6 years ago, those numbers were still 2,000. So are we increasing those numbers, or what happened to those increase in the SME numbers? I think that's an important question for Turkey, because we are getting into this and we need more SMEs in Turkey. So could you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
That's a very good point. And that I go back to. So the SMEs in Europe around biotech are mainly healthcare today. I would say about 80% are healthcare SMEs, and maybe 19% are industrial biotech SMEs, and 1% are ag, because nobody would, in their right mind, would set up a GMO company as an SME in Europe today, because you can't get the products on the market due to the regulatory situation. So the number of SMEs is pretty stable. If you look actually at the OECD, they would estimate around 3,000 in Europe totally. The issue that SMEs have is the funding. So we go back to the discussion we had before. The amount of capital in Europe is 10 times less than the amount of capital in the US. It's just the amount of capital in general, not just for biotech, in general. That's what there is. So the level of injection that you can get in Europe is lower. The numbers are similar to the US. The size of the companies are smaller. And we're desperately trying to create the environments, and again, that goes back to the G20, create those environments that enable SMEs to be part of a community that goes from the SME to the bigger company, but also to the public sector, but also to the governments, where maybe you have public-private partnerships that are easier for SMEs to access. So in the EU at the moment, the new research framework program that funds a lot of research has understood that they need to make SME-specific funds available for individual companies. So not the consortia where you need 2 SMEs, 5 countries, 3 different sizes, because SMEs don't have time to deal with that. And so they've decided, okay, we're going to try a pilot project, it's on biomarkers, and fund individual SME projects. And we'll see how that goes. It's a question of getting the capital in. A lot of the European companies are floating on the US markets. We're trying to connect the European stock markets to make it more attractive. The regulators are trying to make the pathway to approving products for SMEs easier. So the European Medicines Agency has a special office for SMEs where the costs are slashed, so they don't have practically any costs for their dossiers. So there are different ways. It's not easy. You have 28 countries in Europe. It's just not easy to different languages. Angels and VCs often invest in their own turf. They kind of shy away from changing countries. So we've created an SME award every year, Biotech SME Award. Only healthcare and industrial biotech companies are there, no green, just to raise the level of awareness. And we've tried to help change some of the instruments. But really, at the end of the day, it's about the big companies talking to the small companies and creating that environment where biotech is business, and it's going to be okay in Europe as well. So it's about environment as well. It's about visibility of the sector. It's not just about regulation and money, I think.
Great, thanks, Natalie. If I may, I'd like to turn to Fabricio, speaking of development and growth, because I know you've been engaged also with the Turkish government development plans on biotech and pharma. We've just heard from Natalie some of the challenges and opportunities that are there, raising awareness, making the connections, getting the cash and the innovation into the right places together. So maybe if you could just say a few words on what's happening here in Turkey.
Yes, I think this environment is key for the future. For instance, Sanofi, we have local production. We have a plant here in Turkey, one of the biggest one in Europe. And we are already producing 80% of our drugs here. It's locally produced. We want to do better, to do even for biotechnology products, to try to produce here locally. The problem is that we should have quite a a credibility, let's say, in order to convince that investing in Turkey is a benefit. And this is, it's difficult to have. Why? Because the government understood that, that biotechnologies is something important, and they already put on paper a way how to work together to implement global companies to come to produce in Turkey. But now we have to be more concrete, to see really what and how we will implement all those things. So, and I think that it will be something for the future. I think it will not be easy, but we should have some concrete example that will increase credibility, and we will manage really to implement even more global companies in Turkey.
Thanks, Fabrizio. Are there further questions from the floor? Great, okay. Maybe a comment or question really to Asghar. You've highlighted again healthcare and populations as one of the key challenges and issues. From a sort of a strategic perspective within Johnson & Johnson, what would be the one thing that, to coin a phrase, would really shift the needle in terms of moving things forward so we get out of this siloification that Natalie has mentioned around how we treat particularly healthcare and bring biopharma into that space?
Yeah, no, you know, we have a saying in J&J that the world is our lab, so actually we are very open for any kind of collaboration, but any kind of collaboration requires regulation around that, and also, let's say, a kind of that we protect our interests later on. So I mean, patents, these kind of things are very, very important. And I also want to refer what Fabrizio mentioned. Turkey is a very interesting country for us as a company. But you know, what perhaps we should also consider is what is the level, and I also refer what you mentioned about the workforce. You're right, we need to have farmers and these kind of people, but we need also very well educated academics. So the question what we're having, what is the level of education if it comes to these academics in the different countries? Because you need to have great people on the ground. They need support from their own government. They need to have a regulation around that. They need to have the freedom to make research. And we as a company are more than happy to collaborate with everybody. Yeah? So, but you know, again, the key enabler for us in order to provide solutions, innovative solutions to the population in the future is definitely a regulation which helps us to keep our return on invest, because we are a public-based company, so that means you need to have a return. And patent is a key element here, there's one thing. And ideally, a close collaboration with the government, either in a formal public-private partnership or even in a more informal network, which is absolutely fine as well, in order to connect the dots and to ensure that, you know, that we can make research in an environment which also helps us in the future to produce innovation. That's a key enabler.
Great, thank you, Asghar. Joachim.
We have learned it the hard way in Germany that unless you establish university course programs in bioeconomy, you run into this constraint of which Asghar mentioned, of the human resources. So there are now course programs established. Let me also add, we need to be clear what it costs to set up a bioeconomy strategy. For the example of Germany, in the last 6 years, there have been expenditures on the public science side of about 2.5 billion euros for 6 years to establish 3 large clusters with hundreds of scientists, around which then small and medium enterprises have settled. So this startup investment maybe can be done cheaper if more intelligently copied, but that's what it had cost. I think the payoff is high. So we shouldn't just look at costs, who was so expensive, but the returns to business, startup company opportunities, and society are high.
Great, thank you, Joachim. Are there any further questions from the audience and guests? I did promise all of our esteemed guests and panelists a good couple of minutes to round out, and I did promise you I would have you out on time for the Prime Minister and a coffee. So if I may, I would like to start with Fabrizio for some closing remarks.
I think that with biotechnology, we are not speaking only to save life, to improve life expectancy and life quality, but we will also provide a way in order to reduce hospitalization, which is related with a very high cost, to find a solution where patients they have less adverse events. And this will be key, and it will be a benefit for everyone. So I see this as investment for the whole population. I think that in order to come, and if I come back to Turkey, for instance, as an example, but it could be the same for the B20, G20, is that we have really to focus on the regulatory quality and the regulatory framework. And I think that this has to be at the high level for all countries in order really to be successful in biotechnology.
Great, thank you. Asghar.
First of all, I think this is a great platform ready to discuss obviously very hot topics. What I would wish is perhaps that this become the kind of standard forum in the G20, that we have a further discussion about exactly what Fabrizio mentioned, about the regulations, about what is the ecosystem companies and also the government needs to provide solutions for the future. Because I think the challenge we all together are confronted with for the future are huge. It's coming from let's say, sustainability, it's going via healthcare, it's many aspects. So that means we should, let's say, have an open dialogue about that and focusing on different sectors which are quite crucial.
Great, thank you. Natalie.
Thanks, Justin. So, yeah, I mean, just going back to that OECD prediction of 2030, biotech being 2.7% of member states' GDP, I think we have a huge opportunity through the G20 to follow what you might follow to create a national biotech plan, but what you can follow to have a discussion and keep this high on the agenda. So identify bioeconomy or biotech as a priority, create the vision of the goal of where we want to go as a group of countries, not just as individual countries. Measure performance. I think that's really important. I mentioned the report, but you can't follow progress if you don't have a starting point that you're starting from. Share the best practices, identify them, adapt them locally. Focus on your national capabilities. What are you good at in which countries? Don't try and do everything. And then partner nationally, partner internationally, and carry on. And don't let this drop off the G20 agenda.
Thank you, Natalie. We're going to close with Joachim, and I did promise Joachim a few extra words on your bioeconomy summit that you mentioned in November.
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, let me first say I used to be Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute, and in that role was very much in touch and still am with the issue of hunger and food security. Bioeconomy offers great solutions for the poor, for equitable growth. Secondly, bioeconomy offers tremendous opportunities for young people with great ideas. So it addresses the employment issue of youth with ideas. We will call you and others to the first Global Bioeconomy Summit in Berlin, November 25, 26, so in a couple of months. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, has agreed to be patron of this. Look it up on the website, GBS 2015, if you just Google Global Bioeconomy Summit. About 500 experts, business leaders, scientists, policymakers will come together to extend the dialogue which we have started here. And I hope that many of you will come. The business opportunities, I think, are really significant. Thank you.
Thank you, Joachim. I don't know if many of you know, but after our Turkish hosts complete their G20 cycle, we move on to China, and after China, we are due to move on to Germany. So I'm very hopeful this is actually a start of a process, and I look forward to seeing you, Joachim, on stage in a couple of years. Again, thank you to everybody for coming. It's certainly been a very interesting, very rich, and very broad discussion. I think certainly we've identified a number of pieces of a very big jigsaw puzzle. I think it's a question of how we put those jigsaw pieces together. Certainly a number of these recommendations are already included in a number of B20 and G20 task force. I think the missing link between all of them right now is actually the prioritization of biotech. I think the business case has clearly been made this morning. I think the environmental case has also been touched upon. I think there's also a social case and a number of the indirect benefits that come through actually deploying bioeconomy and not just biotechnology more broadly. So with that, I'd like to close to get everybody out on time. Thank you very much for coming. Again, thank you to TOB, TEPAV, to ICC, and also to B20 Turkey. Thank you.